From the racing capital of the world, Indianapolis, Indiana, welcome to Season 6, Episode number 4 of the greatest spectacle in podcasting, the Seventh Gear Overrev Show, presented to you by our great friends at RespectYourPackage.com, makers of Dick Carriers, the premium brand men's underwear, as well as our great friends over at KraussMeats.com for your summer grilling needs. As per usual, I am your host, Kevin Krauss, alongside my good friend and my sidekick, if you will, the one and only Mr. John McGrath. John, how are you this week, buddy?
I'm great and ready to talk about this absolutely insane race that we witnessed over the weekend in Formula One.
Holy crap. Talk about chaos to start the opening round of the 2025 F1 season with rain like nobody's business that completely screwed most of the field. There's so many storylines from this race. For those of you that watched it, you know exactly where we're going with this. For those of you that didn't, you need to go find a replay because this race was absolutely effing nuts. Right, John?
Yeah.
From the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, from the get-go. Unfortunately, from the formation lap for Isaac Hadjar, unfortunately, we saw that result, of course, which was heartbreaking. A lot of the rookies got scooped up by this, and even including Carlos Sainz and Alonso getting scooped up by the rain, unfortunately. But that's how it is, and that's how we kind of expected it to be, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you couldn't help but feel for Isaac Hadjar at Racing Bulls. It was like the two extremes for that team, right? You had Yuki, a brilliant fifth place qualifying run. Hadjar, of course, he's new to the season and new to the series. You didn't expect him to qualify that well, but you also certainly didn't expect him to crash on the formation lap, and just how completely distraught that he was in the aftermath of that. To the point, I mean, we've seen in previous races when guys have gone out on the formation lap, let alone the opening lap, their helmets are off. Maybe they're pissed, maybe they're dejected, whatever, but Isaac never even took his helmet off. It's like he couldn't face the public. He was so distraught over what had happened.
Yeah, it was just absolutely devastating. He's standing on the side, of his Racing Bulls that didn't really look like it took a whole lot of damage. But of course, when the rear wing takes damage, that's a big job to replace, and you're not getting out of that if you do it during the race. And what was really heartfelt was you saw him, standing there, obviously upset, crying, and then as he's walking back to the paddock area or wherever they were headed back to, you saw Anthony Hamilton walk up, which is, of course, Lewis's father, embrace him, and apparently the words that I exchanged, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, was something, hey, chin up. You have a whole career ahead of you. Don't let this stop you. But of course, in his mind, he was thinking, about his family and those things and his friends and everybody that supported him all the way up to this final moment. And even he was even quoted saying, listen, I got into racing not to be in Formula 2 all my life, but to go into Formula 1. And he had reached that point. And unfortunately, the first race debut, it ends in the formation lap, which is, of course, devastating. But I also want to touch upon what Helmut Marko had said, who was, of course, the Red Bull's racing development head, said
Darth
that
Vader of the Red Bull organization,
pretty much, right? The Emperor Palpatine over there says,
seriously,
well, the whole thing, Hadjar crying was I'm quoting here, a bit embarrassing. It's like, I get it. You want your athletes to be headstrong, especially in Red Bull. Red Bull is just, as we know, the most cutthroat team when it comes to anybody else that's not named Max Verstappen, right?
Right.
But give the kid some grace. He knows the embarrassment. He understands what he did. He understands how devastating this is to be on your very first Formula One race and to have this happen. But then when you also have drivers of the caliber of Alonso and Carlos also getting sucked up in this rain, come on, give me a break, dude.
No, I get you. But I was thinking when that all happened on the formation lap, before the Anthony Hamilton thing, before our buddy Helmut opened his big fat old mouth, I was thinking to myself, knowing that it is part of the Red Bull organization. Yes, it's Racing Bulls, not Red Bull, but I was thinking, just because of what you said, John, about how cutthroat that team is and how that's literally what it is at that level, particularly more so at that organization. But I was thinking to myself, great, this kid made this mistake. Now it's almost like a bully targeting, the weaker kid on the school playground, right? Is this kid going to wind up being thought of as week, is he going to then get even more pressure from the team? Is he going to feel more pressure next week going into China to not put a foot wrong, and then not he's going to drive too conservatively, and then is it going to snowball from there? Has he got the mental fortitude? I mean, we talked about that last season when we knew that Lawson was going to partner Max on the A team, right? So
Right.
that is my concern for Hajar, not his talent level. It's the mental aspect of dealing with all the, quite frankly, the shit at that Red Bull organization.
Right, right. And he could be his own worst enemy in this whole thing. And we've also said that for Liam Lawson, he might have the worst job in Formula One. And again, talking about new drivers with new teams, it's looking like maybe you sure to put Yuki in the Red Bull and not Liam, because Liam, not all of it was his fault. Of course, the rain. But he really put in a strong race weekend himself either. And everybody was questioning the judgment of Red Bull. And I forget who it was, but it was Zach Brown. Zach Brown was even saying from McLaren that they make strange driver choices. I think, of course, Zach likes to poke the bear a little bit, especially with Red Bull. But everybody
Yeah.
is now questioning Red Bull's decisions on Liam Lawson.
Well, and to that point, and you and I were talking before we went on air here, John, was Yuki's performance this weekend basically just a big FU to Helmut for not picking him to be
Absolutely.
Max's teammate?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. I think
I
it
didn't
was.
see a fifth place qualifying run coming out of Yuki, but good on him, man. I mean, he had
Yeah,
a
no.
great race weekend despite the conditions, and that's really the biggest story of the entire race. I mean, there was no moisture for any of the FP sessions or qualifying, but everything changed come Sunday morning.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was, let's also talk about the other big surprise I feel like was the weekend was Williams with Carlos Sainz and Albon. Carlos Sainz and Albon. Holy God, those guys really put in some fantastic times, fantastic laps. And I'm holding strong to what I said before the beginning of season. I said right on this show that Williams was going to be the number one B team out of everybody else. And I understand that Carlos crashed, of course, that was due to the rain. But I think once we get into more normal conditions, drier conditions, I really think, and I'm sticking to it because I think my point was proven, that Williams is going to be the top of the B teams. They're going to be probably at this point, I would say probably behind Ferrari because, as we all know, Ferrari is just doing Ferrari things right now. And
Oh
I
God,
believe
yes.
that we'll talk about that here in a second. But yeah, I honestly believe that with Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon, I really believe that Williams is going to just absolutely shine. And I'm really rooting for them, as I said before they even started, that I was going to be in it. I'm glad I can sit back and say I told you so.
Well, of course. And I mean, how could you not root for Williams? The amount of, almost to the point of insolvency, when Claire finally had to sell the team, a few
Yeah,
years back to Doralton Capital, how could you not root for them? I mean, the history behind that organization with Frank and, what he did with Patrick Head and Nigel Mansell and Piquet and Watson and all those guys. I mean, how could you not root for them? And Vols, good for him. I mean, ex Mercedes guy taking the helm over at Williams. And I would say, I mean, certainly with the new sponsorship, that Atlassian sponsorship that they've got now, is they've needed it for years, and now they're
yeah,
reworking all of their internal, record keeping and development and all those things that they could not have done in years past. And I don't know what they did to convince Carlos Sainz to come over there, but I would go so far as to say I think the two strongest driver pairings on the grid this year, as of right now, is McLaren and Williams.
yeah, I fully agree. And of course, those probably have the most experience, right? And I mean, you might argue that Alonso it would have that experience with Stroll, but Stroll is Stroll. I'll just put it that way.
Stroll is Stroll. Exactly. And I mean, think about this too. We've had Williams for the first time in 20 years had two cars qualify inside in the top 10. In 20
That
years,
alone
think
is a
about
win.
that. That's
Yeah,
nuts.
that alone is a win.
Yes.
That alone is a win. So, and that's why they were so happy with, again, unfortunately, Carlos got scooped up by the rain. Oh, well, we move on. I think China will be a different story. I think China, they'll come back stronger with that because they've shown their cards a little bit, saying, hey, they're pretty strong. So, I'm very happy about that. So, we'll see how that goes next week. Well, actually, this weekend in China.
Yeah, unless they paint some more, bike lane stripes and it rains in China,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
in
yeah.
Australia.
So
But yeah, I
let's
mean,
kind of I was gonna say, let's kind of
Yeah,
talk
go ahead.
about though the other sort of hilarious stories, and one specific one that I want to get to because I just
Let the
find it.
hilarity ensue.
So, as you may have heard during the race, Leclerc gets on the radio and says, "Is there a leakage?" They say, "What do you mean leakage of what?" "Water. The car is full of water." And then they come out and say, "Yeah, it must be water," or whatever the hell he said.
Yeah, it's
And
the water.
of course,
What?
Leclerc comes out and says those are real words of wisdom, because I think
Right.
I'm gonna slightly defend the guy on the radio. I think what he meant to say was the drink system. You see what I'm saying? I think he
Well,
meant to
sure.
say that, but in the moment he got caught up in saying, "Oh yeah, it's the water," thinking about the driver's drink system, but instead of saying that, it sounds stupid as hell, and he goes, "Oh yeah, it's the water." Well, no shit, Sherlock. It's just so funny to me, and it was funny. I mean, they're just getting memed to death, by the way, for that whole
Oh,
little
of course
interaction
they
there.
are.
You know, but
And with this, yeah, the meme to death, of course. And to your point earlier, John, Ferrari did very Ferrari like things during the race.
yeah,
They screwed up the strategy. Certainly, they still have a lot of work to do with the communications
yeah.
with Hamilton. I mean, you heard as I
Oh
did, and I'm
yeah,
sure some of
oh
you
yeah.
over at fans, you heard too, where they were talking about the K1 mode, and Hamilton's like, leave me to it. Just leave me to it.
Right.
Like he was
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah.
pissed. And it's like, okay, I get the Italians are handle things one way, but you never dealt with a 7-time world champion before.
Right. It's just going to be one of those things they're going to have to work out. It's like when you get a new coach and a new player, a new quarterback in football, right? They're going to have to figure out where they're all at in communication, especially on the fly information that they have to give to these guys all the time, because those guys are in their ear all the time. And then, we hear quite often throughout the years, "Shut up, leave me alone, let me just drive." And they move on.
Right.
But, but I still hold hope for Ferrari. I do. Obviously, they're going to have to learn each other's ways. It's going to be really interesting that if Hamilton was saying that the car was difficult to drive this weekend. It was a lot of understeer apparently for him. I think once they get things figured out and they get figuring out to what the car that he likes to have, I think we might have a real contention here between McLaren, Red Bull, and Ferrari. And then, of course, there's Mercedes, who, again, let's talk about going into Mercedes. Very strong showing by George, obviously with third. And of course, as you were talking about, Kimi, wow, that kid looks great, man. I'm pulling for him. I'm hoping he does well, and I think he will. I think he's going to be a superstar.
I mean, I literally feel like after watching his drive, after qualifying 16th, and then, yes, of course, he spun in the rain like a lot of the other drivers did, both veterans and rookies alike, but he didn't hit
Yeah, yeah,
anything
yeah.
and he kept his march going. And I said it to you before we went on air. We were witnessing a star being born at Mercedes. And there's obviously, at least the early returns are that Total Wolf's call to promote this now 18-year-old kid. He just
Mm-hmm.
turned 18 years old and
That's
now
right.
he's finished fourth in his maiden Grand Prix.
Yep.
Holy
in
shitballs,
in
kids.
horrible conditions, the
Horrible.
worst you could possibly put them in.
I mean, the kid is blindingly fast, and
Right.
George better watch out, because he's going to be coming to knocking on George's door. I've become less and less of a Russell fan over the last year or two, just because of the mistakes that he's made. But I got to give him credit; he made the call on that tire strategy kind of at the last second, and that's what got him in the podium spot that he did. So, I
Yeah,
mean,
for sure.
good on him, kind of taking that step as quote unquote team lead. But dude, you got that the newest Kimi right
the
there
new
behind you.
Kimi, right, right,
So
and much more joyful than our old Kimi of Kimi Räikkönen. So he seems like a happy kid, and it's
yeah,
nice to
maybe you can
see.
channel some of the the maladjusted Kimi that we've all come to love and know.
So, all right, so let's move on to our race winners, of course, and of course Max Verstappen and Red Bull. Let's talk about that now. Very interesting toward the end there, especially when we saw both McLarens off the track going on an off-road excursion with Formula One cars all at the same time, and watching Lando's mom almost have a heart attack in the pit, which was pretty hilarious.
That was pretty
But
funny.
couple things I see. clearly there's a chink in the armor with Max. He's not as invulnerable as everybody thought he was. Still a good showing. They were still trying to figure out the car. Even like during practice 1, they had that funky paint that's on the car to try to figure out where the airflow is going, which means that they were still trying to figure things out on the car. Max still brought it home for second, which is scary, but that's how great of a driver he is. No matter how much I could talk shit about how I don't like his personality that much, at least as a driver, because from what I understand, he's a completely different person off track versus on track. Okay. But the man outperformed what the expectations were. Of course, Liam Lawson DNF'd. We already went over that. But now we're looking at Oscar Piastri. If he didn't get in trouble, as you said earlier before we were talking, this might be a McLaren on McLaren fight for the Drivers' Championship.
Well, and very clearly, at least at this stage of the season, and obviously we've got 23 more races to go after this one. There's certainly the teams will have their summer break. There's going to be, developments coming throughout the season. So I certainly expect things like the communication issues at Ferrari to get sorted out, for these rookies to get a little bit more, their feet wet and kind of get their feet underneath them a little bit. But at this point, certainly for the Constructors' Championship, I do not see a big challenge to McLaren right now. And we talked about this as well. Think of the driver pairings. You've got, and they just signed Oscar to another contract extension. So they've got Lando and Oscar for like another 4 years. So there's stability there. You got Andreas, running the show there at McLaren. And the only other driver pairing that's the same from last year is at Aston Martin with Stroll and Alonso. So in terms of the Constructors' Championship right now, Lawson is no better than Perez was last year. No better. So
I mean, if not worse,
who's the next?
Depending on how things go, it might be worse. I don't know.
That's right. So who are we going to see challenge, McLaren? Is it going to be Mercedes? Is it going to be Ferrari if they get their act together? I mean, I certainly don't see Red Bull making that big jump. So and as far as the Drivers' Championship goes,
it's wide open.
My money's on Lando.
Yeah, so far my money's on Lando too, but it is wide open. I'm not counting Max out by any means, because something might happen where he might turn it on even further. But then Oscar Piastri, boy, I tell you what, really quiet guy, like off track, like or in interviews, just sort of like keeps to himself. Pretty, I don't want to say low energy, but he's just very calm. But when he's on that track, boy, that kid's cutthroat, man. He will do whatever he has to get ahead. And I think that might have been part of what was going on when both McLarens were off. He was just trying to get to Lando, and it just got a little too much.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching Lando's hands. He has super fast hands. Certainly with Oscar, he got a little offline there, and that just made that approach to, what was it, turn 10 or 11 there, just almost impossible to navigate. And then, of course, you get into wet grass, and thankfully he didn't hit anything and was able to come back and claim some points.
Absolutely.
But interestingly, as a result of that race, both McLaren and I believe it is Mercedes are tied for points on the Constructors' Championship.
Correct. So that is Australia in a nutshell. I don't know what much more to say. Not much to say about Haas or Kick. It was all, typical
Haas
style.
was not. You could say that there's teams that are overwhelming, underwhelming. Haas wasn't even whelming. They were with Ocon and Behrman. I mean, Behrman, poor kid. I mean, crashed in FP1. Then he had gearbox problems. I think he only got one practice session in.
Yeah, Ali Berman had no luck at all. No luck at all.
No. So we'll see what happens in China next weekend, or this weekend, I guess, as you say.
This weekend, yes.
All right. So, any last words for the good of the whole there, my friend?
Nope. This is clearly sort of what we expected. We did expect Mercedes and Red Bull to be continuing the fight. I'm really interested to see how it's going to turn out, though, with Kimi and George and Mercedes. They're good. I mean, let's face it. We already know George is good. Kimi is I think, probably the most surprising as far as the rookies go. Really great to see it. And if I will say this, if Ferrari gets their shit together, it's going to be a good season.
It is going to be a good season. And if you remember right, John, just the beginning of 2 seasons ago when I said Formula One was damn near unwatchable because of the Red Bull dominance? Now it's actually fun to watch.
It is fun to watch.
So All right, John. And Seventh Gear Overhead fans, thanks for tuning in this week for our recap of the chaotic opener to the Formula One season in Australia. Stay tuned to join us next week as we recap the Chinese Grand Prix as well as the IndyCar race from Thermal Club. And in the meantime, make sure that you're following us on all of our social media platforms, on Instagram, on Facebook, all of that good stuff. Follow us on the socials, as they like to say. Like, share, follow us, and hit the subscribe button if you're seeing this on YouTube. And be sure that you join us next week as we recap those races for the greatest spectacle in podcasting. Thanks, John. We'll see you next week.
See ya.